Hello everyone, I'm Professor Geek. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I want to talk about the unique way in which we experience a story through the medium of comic books, and why superheroes are such a natural fit for that medium. In order to do this, we have to think about comic books as visual storytelling, which they are. They're made up of both words and pictures. And we should look at the effect that visual storytelling has on an audience in general. And you really have to trace that back all the way to ancient cave paintings. I've mentioned a little bit about this before in previous videos here and there, but comic historians will commonly point out how you can trace comics back to these cave paintings, such as we've discovered at Altamira or Lascaux. Not a lot is known about the nature of the paintings from early man, but we do know they would use bright colored pigment when they could find it, either that or black, charcoalish kind of matter. And the bright colors were necessary for the darkened caves that they were painted within. If you look up an image search of caves of Altamira or Lascaux, or just cave paintings should do the trick, you'll see that these images are rather rudimentary, but they're usually action poses of some sort, and they were painted on the uneven wall of a cave. Even if it's a comparatively flat area, you still have the rough-hewn, uneven rock surface. And remember that early man would have seen these paintings by firelight. Going into a darkened cave with the light of fire, you can imagine how the flickering flame would send shadows across the uneven wall that these paintings were on, and that could give the illusion of movement almost, especially if there was some sort of religious or initiation ritual about these stories. Certainly if there was any sort of hallucinogens involved in such an initiation. All of that's speculation, but you can see how that would all play into the scenario even more. So visual storytelling from the beginning has never just been about a static image, at least in the human perception. Fast forward to the Bronze Age and so forth, and even to ancient Greece, when visual storytelling was simply about sculptures. The visual pictures were a way of telling stories. Most of the public was illiterate, but they could go and see these images, and that would tell them the story or remind them of the myth of so-and-so or this person or that person. Oftentimes in the temples, there would also be firelight dancing around on the statues, dancing around on the reliefs carved into the walls and so forth. And that's even still present today. In a Catholic church, you'll see the candles flickering around the statue of the Virgin Mary, or whatever saint the church might be dedicated to and so forth. So that still exists. Speaking of Greece, though, and I might have drawn this parallel in other videos before as well, but it bears repeating. On the Parthenon, you had the pediments on either side, and the pediments were the big triangle areas going up to the point of the roof, and that would have certain scenes in it, certain characters and figures. Beneath that, between the pediment and the columns, there were a series of panels called the metopes, and each side of the temple told a different story through those metopes. It was sequential for the most part. You had to look at them from one side or the other. It told a continuous story. And for Greece, for the Parthenon, the temple that was dedicated to the goddess of wisdom and logic and order and justice, Athena, each of these stories conveyed a message of self-control, of moderation, of hanging on to your humanity in the face of primal drives and so forth. There's the war with the Amazons, the war with the giants, the war with the centaurs and so forth. And these were human beings warring with mythical beings who represented some sort of disorder of basic primal and carnal drives and lack of self-control. The metopes also would have been painted in bright colors back in their day. Today we think of the Parthenon simply as concrete because that's all that survives, but they would have been painted in bright colors in the day before it worn off, because people would have to see those figures from the ground and make out what was going on through that large distance. In that distance as well, looking up with the sunlight in your eyes, with the humidity of the day, and the belief that this is a holy building that the ancient Greeks were going to, and that the gods were alive there and active there, it's easy to imagine a certain otherworldly, supernatural effect of movement those images could have had on the ancient Greeks as well. So they would have to see these brightly colored figures in these square panels telling a story sequentially. It's not hard to make the jump then between that and comic books, especially comic book superheroes. Story of brightly colored figures told in sequential square panels to begin with, for the most part. If we move beyond comic books, of course, now we have television and films, and more than just that, HD and IMAX and 3D and so forth. Visual storytelling has certainly come a long ways since comic books, so a lot of people think, what's the big deal about comics then anymore? We've moved beyond that in the evolution of visual storytelling. But I argue no, there's still something uniquely effective and desirable about the medium of comic books that we can't experience anywhere else. We certainly can't experience it watching a screen. To explain this, I need to first talk about the way comic books were printed when they were first created. Comics were printed back in the day by a process known as the Ben-Day process. And this is basically what you might think of as dot matrix printing today. It was a little different in its development, but the use of cyan, magenta, yellow, black, basically the primary colors. In order to make different colors, you would have to place dots of those primary colors, slightly overlapping each other, next to each other in certain patterns and certain ways to give the illusion of different colors. You can see this dot style of printing in some of the pop art that came later in the 60s and so forth, which took comic book panels and blew them up to large scales to try to make pieces of art out of them. That's what those dots are about. That's part of the printing process to give us the colors back in the day. The reason I bring up this dot-colored style of printing is because I believe it has an effect that many people don't know about, and it's an effect akin to the pointillism style of painting. A lot of people are familiar with the famous painting Sunday in the Park by George Seurat. George Seurat pioneered this style of pointillism in painting, which is essentially the Ben-Day printing process, almost. He took little dots of separate colors, so that entire image of Sunday in the Park is made up of separate dots of color. And if you go to see the painting in person, you can step forward and make out the separate dots. It's quite an interesting experience to start close to the painting and then step back slowly, seeing these dots slowly merge into a different color and the whole painting composition suddenly come into focus. There's a sense of movement, a sense of transition. There's an optical illusion to it. Some scientists would say that what's going on here is a visual phenomenon known as antagonism. And it has to do with the different cones of the eyes trying to focus on different colors and such. And I've got a link to an interesting article that explains the specifics of it in the description. But the idea is that the optical illusion creates a living image before you. As you focus on different points in the picture, there's a sense of movement, of color changing, a sense of vibrancy in the image. And since the Ben-Day printing process is essentially pointillism in many ways, you can see some of the same effects from those early comics. Not always consciously. I think a lot of the effect was subconscious, and in fact, this whole phenomena of antagonism, a lot of that is subconscious as well, but it's part of what still draws you to the image and just keeps you there focusing on it, trying to figure out what's going on. You can imagine young children reading comic books when they first came out without the ubiquitous screen in their hand all the time. They may be able to go see a movie now and then, but there were no televisions, no phones on them all of the time, so their eyes were not yet used to this constant barrage of visuals. And these brightly colored images in a comic book would have seemed quite magical to them, literally. Then we have the bright primary colors that the printing process goes to create. And I've talked a little bit in videos before about how there is a psychology connected to certain colors. And certain colors evoke certain feelings from us or certain impressions from us. And I talk about that a lot when I talk about the colors of different superheroes' suits and how certain colors are more appropriate to certain characters because of the impression that they evoke from readers and how that is in line with the values that the hero should embody. But in general, the primary colors, and colors not too far off of the primary scale there, evoke a more visceral response, which is another example of pulling the reader in. It's not just a static image anymore. Between the optical illusions that are coming through consciously or subconsciously or whatever, the color psychology, and then all of the action on the page, panel to panel, there's no actual movement. We know that it, in reality, is a static image. But between the optical illusions, the color psychologies, and then the actual progression of images simulating action, simulating the movement of this character from here to there, and this character punching this character, the comic becomes a living page within your hands. I don't think many people realize anymore how much of a magical experience it is to sit down and read a comic book. The materiality of this medium is unlike any other. Superheroes do extremely well in television shows and films and beyond, but there's a unique appeal in comic books, and that is what caused that to be such a match made in heaven with comic books and superheroes back in the day, and that is why comic books are still predominantly superheroes. They fit. because they are mythic beings as well. They're given to lots of action. When written correctly, they play in to the psychologies that their colors evoke. They pull the reader in, body, mind, emotions. They're the perfect subject matter. Every comic book reader has had the experience of flipping through the pages and all of a sudden there's just mounds and mounds of text. And it's not that you're lazy. You can read a novel and be quite happy. But in a comic book, in that specific medium, it's supposed to be a balance of text and visuals. And if there's too much text, it becomes a burden to move through the story. Superheroes, when written correctly, are able to play into that balance because they're so active. Because they should be moving, they should be engaging in action throughout the story that can balance out the dialogue, the captions, and whatever. There's one last element to the experience of reading a story in a comic book, especially a superhero. You have that illusion of movement, panel to panel, but in the Codex style of a comic book, and by Codex I mean the style of a book that we would think of as just any average book today. It's bound in the spine and you can turn the pages. It can be as thick as the story needs to be. It can be as thin as the story needs to be, but these are pages that you turn. The Codex was a big deal when it was invented and came along after the scroll, because a scroll limited the types of stories you could tell, the length of them, and the linear style in which you had to experience a story through a scroll as you unrolled one end and rolled into another. The Codex, the book as we know it today, allows the reader an almost godlike experience in relation to the story. We are outside of the story and can dip in at our will. We are not subject to the narrative time within the story. In a film, unless you consciously make the effort to stop it, pause it, whatever, you can't really jump around. You can do that in a Codex. You can flip the pages. You can put your finger here and jump back 3 pages and re-experience something that happened 3 pages ago in time in the story. You can freeze time, if you will, and pour over an image, take a splash page and just pick it apart and appreciate the colors or the action or composition of it. You can analyze facial expressions. You can really move through a story in a Codex in a godlike manner, outside of time, able to dip in at your will. Being able to do that with a comic book, with these brightly colored images that are appealing to you visually, emotionally, and so forth in the subconscious, if not the conscious mind, that's an intimate connection to the story, an intimate connection to the characters. And when you're reading a book that you love, about characters that you love, I'm not trying to sound hyperbolic, but it really is a magical experience. I think too many people today just fly through a comic book quickly so they can know the story and move on to the next, give me more. But like any good thing, there's so much more to draw out of it when you savor it. Again, if the comic books are written well, and if the writer and the artist have approached the creation of this comic with all of these things in mind. They don't have to know all of the specific points I've talked about, but with the knowledge that this medium of storytelling is a unique experience for the reader. And if they're writing these characters correctly, to make the most of the character and the medium together in their connection, then you really have a powerful experience on your hands. Comic book superheroes, like the ancient heroes of myth depicted on the metopes of the Parthenon, and even in the cave paintings at Lascaux, should impart values. There should be morals to the story, but as I've said time and again, those values, morals, philosophies of a culture passing down through mythology land in the most fertile soil when they grow organically out of the story. You might have a character failing to think a situation through before running in and then reaping the consequences. But there is a difference between that and a character shoehorned into a story from a certain walk of life and with a certain sermon to preach on the importance of accepting that walk of life. That's not organic, that's not even story, that's propaganda. And the visual medium has certainly been used for propaganda in the past, but that's a severe underutilization and even, I would argue, betrayal of the potential of the comic book experience. And then finally, like back in the day, images and statues and sculptures helped people who couldn't read still gain a story. Comic books have a profound power to help children read. Every now and then I'll run into parents who talk about having to limit their children's comic book reading because they don't want them to become too used to the comics and not know how to read a good novel or this and that. And I understand that drive, but I tell them my own experience that I am a literature and writing professor now at a university, and I was falling so far behind in reading in 4th, 5th grade, whatever it was, that the teachers were trying to send me to summer school. I was so far behind and it just wasn't clicking in my mind. It wasn't something that I was good at, reading comprehension and so forth, until Batman '89 came out in theaters and I became obsessed with the character, and all of a sudden my parents started buying me the comic books. Luckily, I had intelligent teachers at the time who said, yes, give him anything as long as he's going to read it. And I would pore over these comic books, couldn't get enough of them. Read thousands and thousands of them in my childhood, and I have no trouble today sifting through Tolstoy, Shakespeare, or James Joyce, so there's certainly nothing limiting about the experience of comic books. So let me know in the comments what the experience of reading comic books has done for you. Can you see any of these effects I've mentioned as you read comic books as a child, or as you continue to read them today? Of course, the printing process has evolved since then, and we have different things going on visually that are no less important or powerful, though, I believe. So let me know your experiences. Let me know which comic books draw you into the story and refuse to let you go. And if anyone else learned to read with comics like I did, I'd love to know that as well. I'll be back soon with another video. And until then, keep enjoying and digging deeper into the hero stories you love. Thanks for watching.